Thank you for downloading this edition of Start the Week, presented by me, Jonathan Friedland. Hello, we're asking the big questions today. If not the meaning of life, then at least its origin and its future. How did we get here, and where are we going? And what exactly makes us who we are? Questions the great religions have wrestled with since the beginning of time, and which preoccupy the people around this table, except there's not a cleric or theologian among them. I'm joined by three scientists and an artist whose newest work relies on the very latest in medical technology. In the first category is Adam Rutherford, a geneticist and award-winning writer and broadcaster, whose latest book has the modestly epic title of Creation. Barbara Sahakian is a world-renowned researcher in the fields of neurology and psychiatry, who's co-authored Bad Moves, a look at how our brain makes decisions. Susan Aldworth is an artist with a new exhibition of portraits made by mixing traditional printing methods with state-of-the-art brain scans. But we begin with Steve Jones, Emeritus Professor of Genetics at University College London, a former Reith lecturer, author of many books, and his latest is The Serpent's Promise. And Steve Jones, your subtitle is The Bible Retold as Science, which seems an ambitious and in some ways unlikely venture. Give us an example of how you retell the Bible story with a scientific underpinning.
I think the Bible, in many ways, was the world's first scientific textbook. It saw and examined the world around us. It was curious about what was happening, and it came up with explanations, some of which, without question, probably have quite a lot of factual information behind them. Many of the answers are wrong. Understandably, as many of the answers date from long before science itself began. But I had the idea of, as it were, sidestepping the pro and anti-religion debate and seeing what we could do to answer those questions in the modern context. And some of the answers are fairly obvious. One very straightforward one, I think, or rather straightforward one, is the question of Noah's flood. And if you look at the records from the Middle East and elsewhere, there have been repeated floods again and again, which have left marks on history. Even the Thames, actually, has had enormous floods in the last 2,000 years, which people have almost erased memory of. As recently as 1953, indeed, there was a huge flood there. So the question is, how far back can we take this particular flood? And if you believe some of the Greek legends, there was a thing called the Ogygian flood, which was dated at 10,000 years ago, which is, roughly speaking, the end of the last ice age. And you can see that many of the Greek islands, which so many of us have been to, were in those days part of the mainland. And it's very hard to imagine how people responded to the fact that really quite quickly, in a few hundred years, their country had completely changed. And of course what we can now do is discuss that, look into the future, the coming flood, which is certainly going to come with, dare I say it, global warming, and ask how people have responded. And what's fascinating is how many people have turned to the Bible.
So you're saying that there is plenty of floods in different cultures, collective memories, but is there anything that leads you to conclude, this is the flood in the Bible, I've found it?
No, I don't. I think it's hard to do that. This is kind of a generic flood. They've been pointed at several. There was been several floods in what's now Iraq, for example, with stories rather similar to Noah's Ark story of a great ruler who gets on a raft and floats away when everybody else drowns.
Except in the book you say that many years ago, in some research, you found, using the DNA record, a group of people who could indeed trace their origins to just two people, which, as it happens, is the number of passengers on the Ark. Human passengers, of course, we should say.
Well, there were actually more than two on the Ark. But of course, that's by definition. You can trace all of us back to two people, Adam and Eve, long before the Ark, by chasing through famously the Y chromosome for men and the mitochondrial genes for women. And we could do that, and that's been done with some accuracy now. What's interesting, of course, is that they certainly never met, let alone carry out the first and arguably least original of all sins. Adam probably lived around 100,000 years ago. Eve probably lived around 200,000 years ago. There's elements of truth in the Adam and Eve biblical story, but they're pretty distant elements.
And you said you wanted to sidestep the pro and anti-religion debate, and of course, particularly scientists have really engaged with that, and everyone will know of Richard Dawkins' work as a sort of evangelical atheist, pushing that line. Nevertheless, going through the stories in the way you just have, many people will hear that as kind of debunking the Bible story. and therefore that isn't quite sidestepping pro and anti-religion. It's taking a stand on one side, the anti-side.
Well, it depends really the way you look at it. I mean, it's clearly the case that mental disorder is not caused by being possessed with devils, okay? And I think most religious people would agree with me. And I'm not myself at all religious, and writing this book and reading the Bible from end to end hasn't made me any more so. If anything, it's made me a little bit less so. But the problem I have really is that so many British Christians in particular say, oh, the ark, the flood, it was a metaphor. Possession by devils, it's a metaphor. Creation in 7 days, that's a metaphor. My question is, where does the metaphor stop? If it's all a metaphor, it doesn't mean anything. And I think that's what they find difficult to accept. So the great temptation in writing this volume was to turn into a slightly less talented Richard Dawkins when it comes to vulgar abuse, and he's a master at it. I had to get my abusometer out now and again and cut out some of the more unpleasant cracks.
I mean, you certainly say that you approach it with more respect, and you're not in the business of tearing this all down. But something like that, you referred to it about mental disorders and not coming from the devil. I mean, you say that some of the saints many people, millions of people will believe had visions, divinely inspired visions. You say it's more likely they had a bad migraine.
That could well be. I mean, one of the remarkable facts that comes out that I didn't know, simple ignorance on my part, is Lewis Carroll. It's absolutely clear that an awful lot of the Alice in Wonderland story is a migraine attack, because people who have migraines, I have them myself, often see a spinning disc in front of their eyes, okay, a scotoma, which blocks off part of the vision. That's the Cheshire Cat for you. They sometimes feel they're falling down into a dark hole. That's Alice. They sometimes think they're stretching or shrinking. Some people think it's brought on by mushrooms. I point you at the caterpillar. So there's a lot of it in there.
But no one minds you debunking Alice in Wonderland, but people are very attached to the Bible as more than just an entertaining story. And are you, in a way, the person who's sitting there during religious people won't like this idea either, but during a magic show, tapping the audience member on the shoulder saying, I know how that trick's done, and therefore spoiling it for people?
I think you'll have to ask, you need to ask a born-again Christian that. I would have said probably not. I mean, it's clearly the case that if one is having what seems like a conversation with God, the person who's having that conversation, who may perhaps possibly have schizophrenia, that is an entirely real experience for them. I'm not debunking that notion. And it's natural that they believe this to have been the case, that they preach on the subject, they tell people about it. Nowadays, most people would interpret that as a mental disorder of some kind. In ancient times, they would not. That's all, really, I'm saying. And
you began by saying that the Bible is like a science book in the sense it raises these big questions, but many of the answers it includes are wrong. Yeah. Now, if that's the case, and we've had hundreds of years of natural scientific inquiry, why is it that these stories that you go through still retain their power over our imagination? Why have we not moved on, if you like?
Well, they're powerful stories. It's as simple as that. And people need stories. And I have, I have absolute belief in freedom of religion and so on. But the difficulty arises when the stories are put forth as one reality, which disproves the reality of science. And that happens again and again, particularly in my own trade, which is sort of evolution. I'm so sick of being told that I can't tell students about evolution because it's against, not in this country the Bible, but against the Quran. My response to that is, look, if you think that the earth is 6,000 years old, which is not in the Quran but is in the Bible, you are quite simply wrong. And if your belief about that is quite simply wrong, why do you believe anything else in the Quran or the Bible?
And I know you've referred to a new age of endarkenment, which you're concerned about. We'll come back to that point, I think, perhaps. But Barbara Sahakian, listening to all of that, in your own work, and we're going to come on to that specifically and talk about it later, but people are they not resistant to any attempt to explain everything around us, Bible stories or anything else, scientifically? People don't they hold on to an idea that, for example, there's a mind that we have which isn't just our brain, that there isn't always a scientific explanation for everything?
Yes, I think it's very interesting that people like to think about the mind as being different from the brain. But I think the points that Steve raised about mental illness and the fact that obviously in schizophrenia you will hear hallucinations, delusions, the florid symptoms. But intriguingly, those are actually not the problems that people have that stop them from having a good quality of life and good functional outcome. It's actually cognitive problems that they have that stop them from, if they have to drop out of university, going back to university and so forth. So it's very interesting from that point of view that a lot of the focus is on what I think is more something that can actually be treated with the drugs that we have now, which are neuroleptics. But really the focus is on the way we think. And all of these mental disorders are problems of thinking.
Yeah, again, religious people, if they were around this table, would balk, I think, at the description of mental disorders for people of faith having transcendent experiences, is what they would say. Adam Rutherford, in your own book, and generally you talk often about this phrase, playing God. I mean, what is it with scientists and religion that you keep on seeming to come back to it? I mean, here's Steve Jones doing the Bible through science. Your book's called Creation. I mean, have you scientists collectively got a thing about religion?
Well, I think something has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years, and I'm not sure what that is, but I was Steve's student in 1993, and I don't remember there ever being a discussion of intelligent design or creationism when I was doing evolutionary biology with him at UCL. Now, what's really fascinating about this, and Steve's talked about this in the book and elsewhere, is that now that is just fundamentally different. And there were Islamic students there, presumably there were Christian students in our year group, but this never came up as a topic once. And I sort of want to know what happened in the last 20 years.
Steve?
Well, I'm not sure what happened. Something quite striking has happened. What's interesting from the Islamic students' point of view is that an awful lot of their logic is taken from fundamental Christianity. And that I simply don't understand. And it's really quite problematic for me. And I think there's a certain self-defense going on in the scientific world. This age of endarkenment, which isn't my original phrase by any means, where people genuinely believe that the alternative mystical explanations are right, and therefore the science must be wrong.
And these are even people who are coming to you to study science.
It's medicine rather than science, I have to say, which is, of course, an entirely different method of thinking. But science to a degree. And to me, it's a bit like studying, come to study biology without believing in evolution, believing in creationism instead, is like studying physics and rejecting gravity, or studying English and not believing in grammar. It just makes no sense. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's been this sort of efflorescence of books about it.
Barbara Sahakian.
I think people do like to reflect on their consciousness and their personal experiences, and it's hard for them to understand how these can get down to, very molecular sort of basis. And I think that's part of the difficulty for people. How do we explain the way that we think? And we've not really been able to do that as neuroscientists as yet. And perhaps when we're closer to that, we'll be able to make that leap of imagination.
Susan Aldworth.
I was wondering how you look at religion in terms of evolution, because it's certainly there, and it's certainly something that's obviously developed with us as humans.
Yes. I think that's an essential point. The chapter I found most difficult to write was the last chapter, which is called Unto Others. And that's basically the whole of the New Testament. And the New Testament looks forward, whereas the Old Testament overwhelmingly looks back. It's a history text. And it's a fascinating subject. Why should you bother to be nice to anybody? What is the point? Why not just be horrible all the time? You may well do well out of it. And we don't have an answer, really. But
you mean the evolutionary biologist does not have an explanation for altruism?
Yes, we don't. But what's very striking is that we live as primates. We live in groups far, far larger than any other primate or mammal, without, generally speaking, killing each other. Okay, and the argument is, and it's hard to explore now, is that that's what religion did. It brought people together in a common framework of belief, which meant that they agreed about something, even if that something was mystical and mythical, the existence of a divine being, let's say, and that allowed society to persist. Marx, on the other hand, saw it as the opium, the smart drug of the people.
Well, we're going to come on to smart drugs later on, but for now, let's just get on to your book, Adam Rutherford, because you're also grappling with the same questions that religions have grappled with. Your new book, Creation, which is a very unusual book because it's actually two in one. They appear back to back, and one is a sort of upside down on the other. The origin of life is one half, and the future of life is the other. And these are questions that would have preoccupied the great faiths. Let's start with this: the origin of life, that half of the book, if you like. How close close are we through scientific technology and the advances that are happening at galloping speed to coming up with an answer to this very eternal question about how life began?
Well, the thing is, we'll never be able to replicate it. And so the assumption that we will be able to see what happened the first time round, which was 3.9 or 4 billion years ago, is not something that we can achieve. And what we do in science is we look for the best possible fit, the model that describes what fits the evidence that we can see around us. And for a long time, for the origin of life, science has been around for maybe 100 years. Darwin mentions it in 1871. At the beginning of the 20th century, JBS Haldane talks about it, and then in 1953, Stanley Miller does this iconic experiment. It's the 60th anniversary of this, come June or July. But actually, it's not clear that they were asking actually fundamental questions about where life came from. They were more questions about biochemistry, where biochemistry comes from, so where you get the transition from chemistry to biology. Now, I think that the reason I became interested in this subject as someone who has studied genetics is that in the last 10 years it's really blossomed. Molecular biology has opened up a field where we can really quiz scientifically the basis of cellular existence, and therefore start to test how these types of processes, this type of biochemistry might emerge from chemistry. And therefore we can begin to model what we think might have happened 4 billion years ago.
But what you write is that these big discoveries of the last 200 years, whether it's cells or natural selection with Darwin or eventually DNA in the 20th century, they're all pointing in one direction about how life began. And tell us what that is. Well,
yes, somewhat provocatively, as a joke, I sometimes refer to how physicists have been trying to come up with a grand unifying theory for a couple of thousand years and have systematically failed. Whereas in biology, we managed to do it 3 times in the space of 100 years. And
is this what biologists do when they get together? They make jokes about physicists? Is this
yeah,
how it
most of the time.
Okay, my eyes are being open. But go on. So the three unified theories.
Yeah, so there's cell theory, which is basically that all life that we know of is made of cells. There's 2 parts to this. All life is made of cells, and the second is that cells can only come from other cells. So every time you repair a wound, every time you cut yourself shaving, the cells that are being born there are being born from cells that already exist, and you can trace that lineage all the way back through to your first cell, the fertilized egg, and back through the entire history of our species, and all species, in fact. And then there's, chronologically, then Darwin came up with his pretty good idea, which was natural selection, evolution by natural selection. And then in 1953, the 60th anniversary of which is next week, Crick and Watson used the data from Rosalind Franklin and published the double helix. Now, all 3 of those things say exactly the same thing, which is that life is derived from what has come before. And when you map all of them together on what we refer to as the tree of life, there is a single origin point. And so, really, the book is about, I describe it as the prequel to evolution, on the grounds that most of the best books about evolution have already been written, including by Steve to my right here. So I thought that rather than go over that again, I would go up to the beginning of evolution. How do you get from chemistry to biology?
So that idea that we know there is a common source, we're honing in on that. What are the implications of that for what goes next and for the future? And that's the other half of your book, The Future of Life. You conjure up things that are already happening, but which suggest the way this is pointing. And I think if you should tell us about Freckles the goat,
sure,
and how that gives us a signpost to the future.
Sure. So the same process of understanding the molecular biology of the cell, which began in 1953 properly, but really has only blossomed in the last 20 years and become an enormous global industry. We have the same process of understanding the cell that means we can quiz the origin of life has meant that we can manipulate it. And this is genetic modification is what we're talking about here. Instead of being restricted by breeding organisms, animals that can have sex with each other, we can actually take the genes, the DNA from one species and transfer it into another species that may not have had a common ancestor for 1 billion years. Freckles is an example I use. Freckles is a goat in a farm in Utah that has been genetically modified to produce spider silk in her milk. Now, there are many reasons for doing that, one of which is that it's absolutely awesome. But the more important reason is that spider silk is is a material that has tensile properties which are greater than anything that we can make. So this is an extraordinarily advanced molecular form of farming. What's interesting is that freckles is not new technology. I use it as an example because most genetic modification happens in single cells in bacteria, and they're not very visible. The effects are subtle, whereas freckles is an animal that produces spider silk in her milk. I've milked freckles and produced spider silk myself from her. The only goat I've ever milked happened to be a spider.
And this
goat.
is going to be the idea that you then separate out the milk and you then have the material with which spiders spin webs, exactly. And maybe humans can start using that. And you go on to say that this new process of sort of synthetic engineering, really, is even leading to whole new forms that are being created that could come about. I mean, people's reaction, some people will feel the playing God thing will come up. There may even be a sort of yuck factor that people recoil at the idea of a goat producing something that belongs to a spider. What's the case you would make for why this new form of activity, synthetic biology and synthetic engineering, what's in it for us?
Sure. I mean, there is definitely a sort of ick factor, which is a very ill-defined, this doesn't quite feel right, is when you start talking about goats that produce spider silk, it comes to the fore very quickly. Part of my argument is that actually this is what we've been doing for 10,000 years. This is, we refer to it as breeding or farming. Darwin talks about it in the first chapter of The Origin of Species as a means of demonstrating that species are not immutable. They change over time. He was talking about fancy pigeons, so pigeons that have been bred to have preposterous traits, like they're called things like pouters and trumpeters. But almost none of the products that we eat are naturally occurring. Farming is the exact opposite of natural. It is us breeding things. It is unnatural selection, artificial.
So that's the defence of it. But just very in a nutshell, what are some of the benefits that might come about? Because I think people might be very surprised what's potentially in the pipeline.
Sure. Well, bearing in mind that the tools of evolution have had a 4 billion year head start on us, they are pretty effective. So our ability to extract them at the molecular level, to take a gene and put it to a different use from what it's evolved to do, means that my argument is that we're standing on the edge of an industrial revolution where we're talking about the production of drugs, the production of fuels.
Because you mentioned there are bacteria that can excrete diesel potentially.
That exists. So I mean that is in the process of being commercialised. I've driven a car that was fueled on diesel made by yeast. Soon we're going to see the emergence of the most effective anti-malarial drug, which is called artemisinin, not farmed but actually produced by synthetic biology instead.
He's milked a goat, he's driven a bacteria-driven vehicle, he's done everything. Barbara Sahakian.
I think the point that Adam raised, and also you indicated, Jonathan, is very important, that really a lot of what people in society are concerned about is perhaps the ethical issues that are involved in a lot of these scientific discoveries that we have. And I thought that was something that united all of us in terms of what we had to offer, because there's ethical issues to do with everything that we're talking about in our books and also in Susan's artwork. But I think it's important that, as Adam did, that it's pointed out that perhaps we can feed more people. Perhaps, these are mechanisms where we will do benefits for society. And these have to be explained very carefully, I feel, because otherwise, we're scientists outside of society, just reflecting on society as though we're not part of it. And I think we have to join in that discourse and discussion and actually engage with the public about these issues.
And Steve Jones, before I made a joke really about what is it with scientists and religion, but is there perhaps a serious point here that human beings, and with scientists as their representatives, if you like, do aspire somehow to take on those things that previously had been left to the divine realm, in this case, the act of creation itself?
I'd say yes. I mean, I think that's inevitably the case. And the problem, the difference between the two approaches is that science moves on. It has setbacks. In 1905, when the whole of physics really collapsed, we had to start again, but we started again. Faith-based explanations tend not to move on. Or if they do move on, they move on for human reasons. People have changed their minds without evidence. So there's a real difference between the two. When it comes to the future of genetics, I'm reminded of a program I saw in the 1970s, I think, was with a philosopher, God help us, wringing his hands about...
Are they worse than physicists even, in your hierarchy? Yeah.
Wringing his hands about the new genetics of the late 1970s, which was nothing. And he imagined the most horrendous possible experiment we could do. What was it? We could insert an orange gene into a duck. So you'd have instant duck à l'orange, you know. And I thought to myself, this bloke is balmy. And I have somewhat of that feeling of some of the promises being made today. As you know, there's a 4-letter code for DNA, A, G, C, and T. I sometimes think that should be changed to H, Y, P, and E for hype. Because geneticists and those who publicise genetics, myself included, have been fatally ready to overstate what's going to happen. It's worth remembering that we have not yet really cured any genetic disease. Gene therapy in humans has not really gone anywhere. We don't understand the genes behind things like human height, which should be simple. So I think, we should stop being the Pope and start being a little bit more humble about what we can do.
Are you overselling? Are you guilty of hyper, Adam Rutherford? Because you say that it could solve climate change, it could solve all our transport problems, everything.
No, you said it could solve them. I said that we might make some progress in it. No, Steve's absolutely right. We know a lot less than we think we do. There is a difference, I think, and I argue in the book, that synthetic biology has become a little bit like a movement, almost a political movement, and there's a very youthful optimism about it. The reduction in the entry level for what used to be artisan skill has meant that you can get young non-specialists, even school-age children, doing advanced genetic engineering with the sole purpose of addressing an engineering problem. So rather than looking at it from a scientific point of view, they're looking at it as a means of addressing some societal or problem that we might have.
And you describe in the book people literally editing, cutting and pasting, splicing together bits of DNA to see what they come up with. Some people will find that a pretty chilling prospect, amateurs doing that.
Sure. I mean, they are still subject to the regulation that all professional scientists are as well. But it's more that, like electrical engineering did many decades ago, they've standardised the tools of biology to make them much more compatible and much easier to build. So you don't need to spend 3 years doing a PhD in genetic engineering in order to make one single gene. You can now do it as they do at UCL and universities all around the world. Second-year undergraduate students can do it in 6 weeks in their summer holidays.
Well, but ethical issues there, and Barbara Sahakian, you rightly said there are ethical issues running through all of our discussion, including your new book, which is called Bad Moves, How Decision-Making Goes Wrong, and the Ethics of Smart Drugs. And people might not immediately see the connection between those two themes, but let's walk us through that. If you can, you say that something like 35,000 decisions are made almost every day by all of us, and that they can be divided into two categories, cold and hot decisions. So just tell us what that's about.
Yes, so cold decisions are kind of the non-emotional ones, the rational ones as we think of them generally. And this is not a complete distinction between the two. They do overlap, but just for they do have different areas in the brain that are important for this kind of decisions, but they're not completely distinct. So for cold decisions, I often talk when I'm speaking to entrepreneurs or business people at the Judge in Cambridge, that it's the type of thing, suppose you were putting together a business plan and you had to decide who is your market, how much should you price this thing at. So it's all those sorts of decisions, and you'd outline them and you'd calculate it very carefully, and you'd have quite some time to do that. And then there's the hot decisions, and they're the emotional decisions, and frequently they're time limited. So perhaps it's sort of like Dragon's Den or something like that, and people come in with their business plans, and then you interview people. And as you're talking to somebody and interviewing them, you get this sort of gut feeling that this person really knows what they're talking about, and I think they'll be a success, and I'll go with that one. And you might find rational reasons for why you've made that decision, but actually there's something that's happened almost immediately to inform you.
So broadly rational decisions mainly, and broadly emotional reasons. But you explain how people with mental problems of one kind or other have real problems specifically with decision-making.
Well, that's right. I mean, a lot of the problems that people have that actually make it difficult for them to have good functionality in everyday life or hold down work, jobs at work and so forth, have to do with making poor quality decisions or very risky decisions. And we know ourselves, sometimes when we're under pressure and we're very emotional, we might suddenly do something that we wouldn't normally do. So I give examples of hot decisions. It's the type of thing where, you're late and you're supposed to be getting from A to B, and then you suddenly decide, shall I go down the bus lane? And you sort of, or perhaps you see somebody doing something, cutting in line in traffic, and you get very outraged and start, gesturing at them or something like that. So you have these emotional things that happen to all of us and override our sort of rational behavior sometimes.
But somebody who has an extreme problem, a kind of mania, or
so in mania you might max your credit card, or you might do something indiscreet, and sometimes that happens. I often say when I'm talking about hot decisions, suppose there's a young man and he's supposed to be studying for his exams that are happening the next day, and his friends say, oh, let's go out to this pub because the girl you want to meet is there, and he's sort of tempted. So there's this very strong rewarding aspect to making this decision to go, but on the other hand it's very risky.
And you've also explained elsewhere that the entrepreneurs, very successful ones, do tend to make quite risky decisions. But on the point of people who have problems, either problems of the brain, Alzheimer's or mania, depression, you explain in the book how drugs have come along, cognitive enhancing drugs, which actually help them in that area. How can drugs help people with that kind of decision making?
Well, a lot of the poor decisions or risky decisions are made impulsively, and we do have drugs that can actually control impulsive behavior. And in my studies, these work not only in groups who have high levels of impulsivity, such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or mania, but also they work in healthy, normal people. So they're actually doing the same sort of thing, and they help you sort of have cognitive control of your behavior and stop that impulsive urge that you have to.
See, this is a bit where it gets interesting ethically, because you're telling us in the book that these drugs are now used by people, healthy people, and they find they get a good effect, so-called smart drugs. They make them smarter and sharper. And you mentioned one drug, modafinil, and you say you were offered it by, of all people, academics. This wasn't your students who were offering you to sort of trip out on this drug. Your fellow colleagues were saying, this is going to be good for you.
That's right. I was lecturing in Florida, and I was very tired having travelled over there. And I turned to my colleague and I said, it's a shame they put me in the late afternoon and I'm, a bit jet-lagged. And he said, would you like some of my modafinil? So I thought, oh, do you take modafinil? He said, oh, I take it all the time for jet lag. So then when we broke for sort of coffee and everything, I started chatting with everybody
coffee on top of the modafinil, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's right. a very enhancer that most people use. But when we broke for coffee, I asked other people, and they were taking Ritalin, which is methylphenidate, and some were taking Adderall, which is amphetamine salts. So I actually did a paper for Nature with Sharon Marin Zamir called Professor's Little Helper, and inquired with some of my colleagues why they were using these drugs. And then Nature did an online survey, and they got 1,400 respondents, and 1 in 5 of those was using a cognitive enhancing drug.
So this is interesting. If scholars are somehow at a leading edge of this suggests that there's going to be a future where perhaps all of us are going to be taking smart drugs. Why not? To become sharper, improved memory, etc.
Some people think that we will be in the future. I mean, we haven't as yet mentioned pharmacogenomics, but when we understand how the bodies respond in terms of our genetics to drugs, we'll be able to hopefully get drugs that are just perfect in terms of treatments with very, very low side effects, but also, of course, it will affect other sorts of drugs that we may take, such as cognitive enhancers.
Susan Alder, listening to this, I mean, we're going to come on to talk in detail about your work, that you do there depict people's brains as part of a portrait of those people, when we'll hear how you do that. But was it important to you that you depict a person's brain somehow as it really is, rather than if they were on a drug like this?
Well, the people I was working with had epilepsy, so they're highly medicated to control the epilepsy, and the word that came out from them was they often felt obtunded, dulled down. They didn't ever quite feel themselves. In fact, last night I had dinner with a young guy who'd been on Ritalin for 5 years, and he stopped taking it And he said he felt he'd got his self back. So the relationship to yourself and your body is something that can be enhanced and changed, but over-medication might be a problem.
Over-medication is certainly a problem, and that should never happen. But some people, it's interesting because really you're getting a personhood. And some people with ADHD's children will say, I feel myself when I'm not on the drug. And others will say, I feel myself when I'm on the drug because people like me. The other children like me, I'm doing better at school and that type of thing. So, and a lot of people don't like some of the side effects of medication. I hope we can improve those because it would make people's quality of life so much better.
But do you yourself take a view on which is the real person, the person with attention deficit disorder who's on the drug Ritalin or not on it? Which is the real one?
Well, we're restoring chemicals in the brain that should be functioning at a certain level to help people perform well. But as we know, we're all sort of different. Some of us are better at planning. Some of us have very good memories. Some of us are hopeless navigating through space. So as individuals, we're all different anyway.
Adam Rutherford, you talk about a kind of Luddite reaction to these scientific advances. Is it just pure Luddism to worry about people, otherwise healthy people, taking these kind of smart drugs?
I think we should be concerned, but it should be evidence-based. But, we've been doing body modification for hundreds of years. Both you and Steve are both wearing glasses. Now, I don't think there would ever be an ethical question about whether that is an unquestionable improvement to the quality of both of your lives. I think the point that is really inherent in Barbara's work is that we need to approach these subjects. They are essential, but we need to do it in a really robust, evidence-based way. And so off-prescription taking of modafinil, we don't really have a structure in which we can actually test that to see whether there are definite benefits and no side effects. If there were no side effects and we knew that in a really evidence-based way, then there would be a strong case for giving modafinil to everyone.
Steve Jones, briefly.
I'd like to congratulate Barbara on a beautiful quote from George Best. I spent a lot of money on booze, birds and fast cars. The rest I just squandered. That sort of summarises it, really. I think it's a difficult issue. I mean, I was once asked, and there would be nothing in it, I was once asked whether I'd be interested in writing my autobiography, and my mind went blank. And I said, well, I've got the title. It'll be called Scrubbed Clean by Chardonnay. In other words, I'm somebody who drinks, and have drinks for many years, and that's clearly bad for you. There's no question of that at all. It changes one's personality. And yet, somehow, we accept that. Now,
so why not accept these drugs?
So if we accept that, and that's simply a poison, you do have more or less the same effect by hitting yourself on the head with the bottle. If we accept that, I think we should at least be able to discuss some of these other issues.
Well, we're talking about brain disorders, not necessarily inflicted by whacking yourself over there with a bottle, but understanding brain disorders is not purely the work of doctors and scientists, but also, as we've been hearing, artists. And you, Susan Aldworth, your exhibition, The Portrait Anatomised, at the National Portrait Gallery in London, depicts, as you were saying, 3 people suffering from epilepsy, and the portraits you construct are made up with traditional printing techniques, in some ways quite sort of old-fashioned looking, and then embedded in the portrait are brain scans of these people. What does it for you add to that portrait to have a brain scan, often in front and centre in the portrait?
Well, I think we live in extraordinary times when neuroscience, I think, in the 21st century is the main sort of philosophical leader in telling us who we might be. I don't understand neuroscience completely, but I understand it enough to know that it is giving us a description of the self that is certainly worth looking at. So when I approach any sort of work to do with it with people, I want to look at all the different narratives that's going on. The narratives of portraiture are usually the external surface, but neuroscience is profoundly image-led as well, and for an artist it's terribly exciting to see these images and to try and place them within the identity of the person that you're looking at.
And do you feel you're able to get to the identity of the person by showing their brain? Are you somehow showing their mind as well, do you think?
No, I think scans show the anatomy of a person, but I think they signpost interiority, and they're certainly part of the visual language I want to develop for it. And I think people's relationship to their brain scans, often they ask to be given them if they've been to a hospital. So I think for them they're a profound object as well.
But there are some parts of us that aren't captured in a brain scan.
Oh, yeah.
And
the self isn't captured in
and that's partly what the rest of the portrait, when you do them, is conveying the eyes and the face, etc., and more. Barbara Sahakian.
I think it's wonderful that, this sort of approach which combines this ideas about the brain and understanding of the brain with the person's, personality. And really, it's very brave of the people who sit for Susan that they are willing to expose themselves in that way. But I think it's very useful for society because we have far too much stigma in mental health disorders and neuropsychiatric disorders. And I think this is one way to reduce it, that there's so many of us that have these sorts of problems, and yet we don't talk about it very much as a society.
Was that part of your project, Susan Aldworth?
Yeah, the idea of talking about epilepsy in public, which is one of the great reasons to show the work at the National Portrait Gallery, which usually just shows the great and the good. And here, there's extraordinary people, but they aren't celebrities. And we're hoping that epilepsy will be part of the discussions. But my work is more exploratory about portraiture rather than trying to do something as grand as destigmatise something.
And Adam Rutherford, we hear of an artist there who's using science to make art. Is this a two-way street? Do you ever use art to make science, to advance science?
Absolutely, and in fact, much of Susan's work, the aesthetic of Susan's work, reminded me of Leonardo da Vinci's anatomy drawings, which are very visceral. And I really like anatomical art. I think I watched too many horror films when I was a teenager, but really, I wondered if your work, you felt like your work was part of that tradition of really taking apart bodies to look at how they work, because it is quite visceral.
Yeah, no, I mean I love the history of the anatomical. I'm very much in that history, and I also play with it because I've reassembled these bodies in many ways and put body parts in the wrong place to make people think, how am I made?
All right, thank you. To all my guests, Adam Rutherford's Creation, The Origin of Life, The Future of Life, 2 books in one, is out now. Steve Jones's The Serpent Promise, The Bible Retold as Science, is out on the 2nd of May. Bad Moves, How Decision-Making Goes Wrong and the Ethics of Smart Drugs by Barbara Sahakian and her co-author Jamie Nicole Labuzetta is published on the 25th of April. And Susan Aldworth, The Portrait Anatomized, is on at the National Portrait Gallery in London until the 1st of September. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe gets a taste of La Dolce Vita with Bernardo Bertolucci, Antonio Papano, Tim Parks and Annalisa Pires. But for now, from me, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Thank you for downloading this edition of Start the Week, presented by me, Jonathan Friedland. Hello, we're asking the big questions today. If not the meaning of life, then at least its origin and its future. How did we get here, and where are we going? And what exactly makes us who we are? Questions the great religions have wrestled with since the beginning of time, and which preoccupy the people around this table, except there's not a cleric or theologian among them. I'm joined by 3 scientists and an artist whose newest work relies on the very latest in medical technology. In the first category is Adam Rutherford, a geneticist and award-winning writer and broadcaster, whose latest book has the modestly epic title of Creation. Barbara Sahakian is a world-renowned researcher in the fields of neurology and psychiatry who's co-authored Bad Moves, a look at how our brain makes decisions. Susan Aldworth is an artist with a new exhibition of portraits made by mixing traditional printing methods with state-of-the-art brain scans. But we begin with Steve Jones, Emeritus Professor of Genetics at University College London, a former Reith lecturer, author of many books, and his latest is The Serpent's Promise. And Steve Jones, your subtitle is The Bible Retold as Science, which seems an ambitious and in some ways unlikely venture. Give us an example of how you retell the Bible story with a scientific underpinning.
I think the Bible, in many ways, was the world's first scientific textbook. It saw and examined the world around us. It was curious about what was happening, and it came up with explanations. So, which, without question, probably have quite a lot of factual information behind them. Many of the answers are wrong. understandably, as many of the answers date from long before science itself began. But I had the idea of, as it were, sidestepping the pro and anti-religion debate and seeing what we could do to answer those questions in the modern context. And some of the answers are fairly obvious. One very straightforward one, I think, or rather straightforward one, is the question of Noah's flood. And if you look at the records from the Middle East and elsewhere, there have been repeated floods again and again, which have left marks on history. Even the Thames, actually, has had enormous floods in the last...
Particularly scientists have really engaged with that, and everyone will know of Richard Dawkins' work as a sort of evangelical atheist, pushing that line. Nevertheless, going through the stories in the way you just have, many people will hear that as kind of debunking the Bible story. And therefore that isn't quite sidestepping pro and anti-religion. It's taking a stand on one side, the anti-side.
Well, it depends really the way you look at it. I mean, it's clearly the case that mental disorder is not caused by being possessed with devils, okay? And I think most religious people would agree with me. And I'm not myself at all religious. And writing this book and reading the Bible from end to end hasn't made me any more so. If anything, it's made me a little bit less so. But the problem I have really is that so many British Christians in particular say, oh, the ark, the flood, it was a metaphor. Possession by devils, it's a metaphor. Creation in 7 days, that's a metaphor. My question is, where does the metaphor stop? If it's all a metaphor, it doesn't mean anything. And I think that's what they find difficult to accept. So the great temptation in writing this volume was to turn into a slightly less talented, in what's now Iraq, for example, with stories rather similar to the Noah's Ark story of a great ruler who gets on a raft and floats away when everybody else drowns.
Except in the book you say that many years ago, in some research, you found, using the DNA record, a group of people who could indeed trace their origins to just 2 people, which, as it happens, is the number of passengers on the Ark. Human passengers, of course, we should say.
Well, there were actually more than 2 on the Ark. But of course, that's by definition. You can trace all of us back to 2 people, Adam and Eve, long before the Ark, by chasing through famously the Y chromosome for men and the mitochondrial genes for women. And we could do that, and that's been done with some accuracy now. What's interesting, of course, is that they certainly never met, let alone carry out the first and arguably least original of all sins. Adam probably lived around 100,000 years ago. Eve probably lived around 200,000 years ago. There's elements of truth in the Adam and Eve biblical story, but they're pretty distant elements.
And you said you wanted to sidestep the pro and anti-religion debate, and of course
2,000 years, which people have almost erased memory of. As recently as 1953, indeed, there was a huge flood there. So the question is, how far back can we take this particular flood? And if you believe some of the Greek legends, there was a thing called the Ogygian flood, which was dated at 10,000 years ago, which is, roughly speaking, the end of the last ice age. And you can see that many of the Greek islands, which so many of us have been to, were in those days part of the mainland. And it's very hard to imagine how people responded to the fact that really quite quickly, in a few hundred years, their country had completely changed. And of course what we can now do is discuss that, look into the future, the coming flood, which is certainly going to come with, dare I say it, global warming, and ask how people have responded. And what's fascinating is how many people have turned to the Bible.
So you're saying that there is plenty of floods in different cultures, collective memories, but is there anything that leads you to conclude, this is the flood in the Bible, I've found it?
No, I don't. I think it's hard to do that. This is kind of a generic flood. They've been pointed at several. There was been several floods on the